The Mainline Murders, Chapter 2. It was a bright September morning at the start of the autumn semester. After leaving the station, David had taken the scenic route to Cranwell University, past the great hall with its medieval windows and sandstone turrets. He hadn't taken the shorter path via the Rathbone Library since it was completed in the late 90s, as he found its green metal frame and floor-length windows an offence against good taste. At the time it was built, he had written a complaint to the governors, stating the library was an architectural disaster. He never received a reply. He nodded to a couple of lecturers in discussion near the main entrance. He didn't bother to stop when they shouted "Good morning." He knew from past experience, whatever they were discussing, it wouldn't be interesting enough to capture his attention for long. Just ahead he saw a group of young females, and judging by the Gothic outfits they wore, David surmised they were from the Fine Arts Department. He listened in as he got nearer, where he discovered the blonde girl had a slight lisp. He found it strangely appealing. He slowed down and waited until the cluster had disintegrated and the young blonde was walking on her own. "Are you looking for the history department?" he asked. "No, I was actually looking for the library." "You passed it back there," he said, flashing his most disarming smile. "You seem a bit lost. Is it your first day?" "Yes," she replied shyly. "I'm Dr. Sutherland," he said, leaning in much closer, "and my office is just over there. If you need anything, let me know," he said, with a confidential smile. "Thanks, but I need to go," she said, blushing a little and turning away. David watched her retreat. He wasn't used to being brushed off so quickly. He realised that the blonde hadn't even given him her name. He sighed and pushed open his office door, hoping this was not a bad omen. His office was an uncluttered room, situated in the annex that was converted from the university chapel. 12 years ago, when he had been appointed as the head of the history department, David was allocated a more spacious office in the Longford building. But he had thought its design too modern and characterless. "It's like a bloody prefab," he told the woman in administration. But she had insisted there was nothing else available. Disappointed by a lack of support, David had decided to find a solution to the problem himself. After much negotiation, he had accepted his current room, because of its original stained glass windows and excellent view over the quadrangle. It was tastefully furnished, with several pieces of antique furniture, which he had acquired from other parts of the university. He was particularly pleased with the solid mahogany writing desk, which used to belong to the library. Before the old library building had closed, David had requested the desk for his office. Peter Knowles, the chief librarian, had made a huge fuss at the time, but as David had argued, the desk would have looked incongruous in the new Rathbone Library amongst its plastic tables and chairs. The desk should be treated with respect as a tribute to its fine craftsmanship, he said, thinking it would be buggered before it went to the library. In the end, David had triumphed, and Peter Knowles, who David still regarded with contempt, had completely backed down. Sitting in his comfortable leather chair, he spread his papers with meticulous care over his beautifully polished desk. His chair was a standard issue, of course. The Vice-Chancellor, Professor Tony Ingram, a fellow sufferer of a painful lower back condition, had proved sympathetic to David's request for a more comfortable seat. He had already spent 20 minutes putting his papers into the correct sequence for this morning's agenda at the departmental meeting. But he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. His mind kept racing back to the last departmental meeting, which had been a fiasco. He had been ill-prepared for battle with Roger Barrister, his fellow history lecturer and arch-enemy, who had outmanoeuvred him at every turn. He was determined that it would be different this time, and he had carefully formulated his plan of attack. He would employ his new strategy on budget spending. All it would take was a few willing allies to carry it through. He could usually rely on support from the temporary lecturers, as they had avoided upsetting him in the past, and their short-term contracts were up for renewal in the spring. Roger Barrister was the real threat, the self-appointed spokesman of dissent. David tissued the sweat from his brow. What he really needed was to find a way of keeping Roger in his place and reaffirming himself as the undisputed ruler of the history department. David arrived late for the meeting, as he preferred everyone else to be seated when he entered the room. After scanning his opponent, he took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't speak until he had poured himself a large glass of water. "Are we expecting Roger this morning?" he asked. David noticed that Jerry Carpenter, Roger's sidekick, was deliberately avoiding his eye contact. "Jerry, have you spoken to Roger?" he asks, having modulated his tone in order to fake concern. Jerry glanced around the room, but he was unable to find any support. "Yes, he'll be a little late this morning." David waited for further information, but none was forthcoming. "Jerry, must I remind you to inform me of problems affecting my staff?" he said icily. "We'll carry on without him. The first issue on today's agenda is budget spending." The door opened and Roger sauntered casually to his seat. David seethed with anger as Roger removed several bulging files from his briefcase and stacked them meaningfully onto the table. "Glad you were able to join us at last," said David, who had already lost the battle to keep the sarcasm out of his voice. "Have I missed anything?" "Budget spending," said David, still angry at the lack of an apology. Roger smiled and ran a carefully manicured hand through his blow-dried hair. "I have a couple of suggestions." 20 minutes later, Roger concluded his list of budget-cutting exercises, none of which specifically affected his own courses in medieval Russian and European history. David had tried to divert the flow of figures and rhetoric, but the man could lie like a lawyer. Struggling alone against the tide of opinion, David conceded to Roger, who had hijacked the departmental meeting yet again. In utter disgust, David slammed his files down onto the table and projected his contempt across the room. It fell silent. The meeting was over. Back in his office, David was fuming. Deliberate humiliation? Well, he wasn't going to stand for it. Not from Roger or anyone else in the department. If there was something going on behind his back, he would soon find out, because in Cranwell University, knowledge was the currency of power, and there were few adversaries more powerful than David. With the reorganisation coming up, he could not afford to be complacent. Maybe Jerry Carpenter knew something about Roger's position in the new structure. He wondered whether they were all deliberately freezing him out. His imagination flexed, and he became certain of it. In the afternoon, David examined his list of undergraduates carefully. She mustn't be too old or experienced. That would never work. He watched the women file into the room, taking mental notes. Too dark, too old, too ugly. He was momentarily distracted by a girl in red stilettos, even though she was not his type. He closed his eyes and listened to the tap-tapping of her heels across the wooden floor. Her shoes were the type he liked best. Shiny patent leather, clean and polished, with the type of heels that narrow into a vicious metal stud, sharp enough to pierce a man through the heart. He began his lecture on the rise of consumer society in 18th century England with confidence and authority. Being an expert in his specialist area, he was well respected in his field. He greatly enjoyed the prestige and admiration he received as a result of this, particularly from women. Glancing over his audience, he had their attention. He could feel it. Waiting for the glance that lingered a little too long, he tried not to think of Jennifer. He had taken her to a hotel, a cheap one. The room was small and dingy, the bedspread was crumpled, and the headboard was covered in stains. From along the corridor drifted a worn-out tune, "Your cheating heart will tell on you." Almost laughing at the vulgarity of it, He had looked at Jennifer, but she wasn't laughing. She really wanted him. He could see that. He didn't know what to do. Feeling like an actor who couldn't carry off the scene, he thought about leaving. But she had taken off her blouse, and he knew it was too late. He drew the flimsy curtains, and with his eyes closed he felt her soft warm skin, but his mind strayed to thoughts of Julia. What would she say if she found out? The voice in his head was bitter and angry. "You're a lying, cheating bastard," it said. "I really want you," said Jennifer. I know," he murmured to them both. There had been other times in other places, but it was always the first time, he remembered.